Hey, this is Matt Cropp. I am the chair of the Oak Street Cooperative and doing a little info session on the project that we're trying to purchase, the property at 8890 Oak Street. So I'm going to be walk through a little bit about some highlights about what the project is, how it works, and then kind of have some space for conversation and discussion at the end. So kind of starting the overview of what this is. This building currently houses the Chubby Muffin in Burlington. It has a 3-bedroom apartment upstairs, a cafe, and a fairly large commissary food prep space downstairs. And so the idea of a real estate co-op in Burlington has been kind of percolating for a few years. There are a bunch of folks involved in an investment club that invests primarily in co-ops that have been talking about it. There's some other cities that have this model: Minneapolis, Oakland. There's one trying to get started in New York City. But basically the idea is you have a consumer co-op. It's like legally sort of organized on the same basis as something like City Market, where it's owned by, you buy a share. The shares, it's a one member, one vote for governance. So it's a democracy. You have a board of directors that's elected by the members. And then it pays out, and then tenants can be members, and then community members who aren't tenants can also be members. And so the financial piece of it is, you can purchase under the laws that kind of govern co-ops in Vermont. You can purchase more than one share, but still only have one vote. And the return can be up to a 6% dividend a year on the investment. There's also the limitation that no member can own more than 10% of the total shares, so that it kind of keeps ownership broad-based. And so the co-op, this kind of co-op structure, if you stay within those kind of guardrails, it's much simpler to sort of sell shares in a co-op than it is to sell kind of like other forms of investment. So for instance, at City Market, you can buy a share at the cash register. So it's legally the same type of share as a share at City Market. And so the other thing financially is that for tenants, if the co-op turns a profit, then after paying out dividend and all of that, the tenants can potentially receive essentially a patronage refund on their rent, just like at City Market. Sometimes they would send out a check based on the amount you spent on groceries. So same logic. So the idea for the real estate co-op is that you have this, the co-op owns the property and then it rents to tenants, and then those tenants can kind of help both participate as co-owners of the property along with community members, and there's sort of a capped return for investors, and so it can kind of create long-term stability for tenants, buildings, neighborhoods, etc. So we're able to adapt the model to the Vermont context legally. And beginning of last year, started having some informal conversations with Benji, who is one of the owners and founders of the Skinny Pancake, which currently owns the building. They outgrew it and are looking to move. It's currently kind of a commissary space being used to supply a lot of other restaurants aside from the Chubby Muffin. And they're looking to consolidate that commissary space into a larger facility, and so are looking to sell the building after owning it for about a decade. So we discussed the idea of kind of transitioning it to co-op ownership to maintain its function both as a neighborhood space and also as a using the infrastructure they built, kind of keeping that in the local food system, and had also brought in the folks who have come to be positioned as the anchor tenants in the building, Abby and Emily Portman, who are looking to open a breakfast lunch cafe called Poppy, and then Maria, who runs Cafe Mama Juana, would be then serving Dominican food for dinner. And then there's also enough space in there that there's been conversations with several different food businesses about possibly having a third tenant subletting, because there's significant cold storage, dry storage, maybe 500 more square feet that could be used for food production space. So there's a number of opportunities for kind of either incubator or storage for folks who have home-based food production businesses, that sort of thing, as kind of a supplemental form of tenancy in the building. So in terms of the campaign and the structure of the campaign, we signed a purchase and sale agreement on the space in December and are doing a campaign hosted through Milk Money Vermont that where we're seeking to raise $175,000 in equity that would cover a 20% down payment plus the sort of startup launch costs for the building. We have a mortgage application into VSECU. There's a couple of other lenders we're considering, but we're waiting to hear back on that one first. And so the kind of some of the other characteristics of the shares, aside from one member, one vote, we set the minimum investment at $1,000. Target dividend of 6%. In years where we aren't able to pay that in cash, then essentially the dividend will be deferred, but then to be paid in the future when there's more cash flow. So that gives some flexibility to the co-op, but also means that those dividends will be paid before any patronage refunds are paid to tenants. And then in terms of liquidity for the investments, each year, once a sufficient surplus is set aside, the co-op will allocate some funds to buy back shares from those who would like to have them bought back. And we'll also put out the offer for any members who would like to invest additional funds that they could essentially invest into the co-op, buy some shares, and then the folks who want to sort of get their money out of the co-op would sell their shares back to the co-op. So the shares aren't, there's not going to be a secondary market for them, but the co-op will be sort of the place through which they can be liquidated if there's either demand for the shares from others or there's kind of surplus funds in the co-op that can be devoted to buying down kind of those investor members. And as investor members are bought down, then that means there's more available for kind of patronage for the tenants or improvements in terms of sustainability and other things like that. The other piece is there's some folks who have pre-existing relationships with founding members who are out of state. So one of the requirements is for in-staters or for members is you have to be an in-state resident. Co-ops can also issue non-voting preferred shares, which don't, as it sounds like, don't have any voting rights. But we can do something where we can issue those and sell them to like a few folks out of state who have pre-existing relationships to the folks who are involved in founding the co-op. So there's one family member of a founder who's committed some funds, and there's a few others who are talking about it. So that's kind of a secondary source of equity that we're exploring as part of the total package. And so basically, then our goal is to, and according to our purchase and sale agreement currently, our goal is to have the 175,000 sort of minimum raised by March 1st. We're about a third of the way there now. I think, or almost exactly a third of the way, 58,000. So we're kind of looking for investments between 1 and 20,000. Certainly, like if we get over the 175, that means we have to take out that much less of a mortgage, so that would be good. But so 175 was the number that we set as the kind of solid, like we feel good about going from there. So that's the quick overview, and yeah, so I'll just open it up, and Marcy or Louisa or others, if you have questions, thoughts, things if you've reviewed any materials that kind of popped out at you that you're wondering about.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess maybe my first question would be, so you had said something about like if the dividends aren't able to get paid, like they would be deferred. Can you speak more about that a little bit?
Correct. So basically, the cycle of the co-op will be each year. The co-op will kind of close its books for the previous year and say, okay, so how much of a surplus did we have, or a loss did we have, or what have you. And then the board will at that point say, okay, so we're going to declare a dividend. And from a strategic perspective, making sure we're meeting all of our expenses, paying all of our paying our debts, all of that. So what money do we have left over then? And then setting aside a reserve to say, okay, it would be good to have, let's say, six months of operating expenses sitting in reserve, so that if there's a hiccup or a major, unexpected capital expense or something like that, we have a pot of money that can be dipped into if needed. So, once those kinds of core operating expenses and reserves are, feeling like in a good position, then the next thing that the co-op will use money on is the dividend. And so if the board says, all right, this year we feel comfortable paying out, our full 6% dividend, cut checks to everyone, they go out, and then we issue a 1099 div to folks, kind of from a taxes perspective. If it's something where things are feeling tight, or there's been an unexpected expense, or something is, that paying out a dividend would kind of put the co-op in a tight position, or then what the board can do is say, okay, so we're going to declare the dividend but defer it. So basically, what that means is, the co-op says, we owe you, the members, that 6% dividend, or maybe we paid 3% cash that year and then deferred the other 3%. And then in future years, if the co-op pays a dividend, the first thing it will pay is that deferred dividend, and then the current year dividend, and then it won't pay any patronage to the sort of tenant members that kind of refund on a portion of their rent until any deferred dividends have been paid up.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So that gives it some flexibility, but means that like the obligation remains there.
Right. Okay. So I'm interested in like risks and benefits, because the money that I have that I'm thinking of using for this is basically in a savings account. It's like, I have to look up what the interest rate is, but I'm pretty sure it's not 6%. So I'm kind of, as I'm very kind of new to all of this, I just want to, if I put in, some of this money into this, like what would be my risks and benefits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of risks, right, there would be, the risk of, the businesses go out of business, the real estate market, crashes, and we can't fill it. And so, worst case scenario is the co-op can't pay its mortgage, the building gets foreclosed on and sold, and sold at under market value in a disaster, 2008 style real estate crash or something like that, right? So there would be, kind of painting the darkest picture, right? The possibility of losing a significant portion to all of the funds in something like that. Kind of a more middle of the road realistic picture might be that with maybe a partial loss, or maybe even not much of a loss, but not much of a gain, would be, again, you have something where tenants don't work out, major expense happens, and the co-op decides, okay, we're gonna, this was a good run, but we're gonna liquidate the property, and in which case, and wind up the co-op, in which case basically we say, all right, the first of all, the bank gets paid from the proceeds of selling the building, and then any outstanding preferred shares get paid, any deferred dividends get paid, members end up getting what, at least made as whole as possible. So there is, unlike sort of say an investment in an operating business, there is like an asset there that can be liquidated, and the longer we go, the more kind of equity we'll have in the asset as the mortgage is paid down. So that's kind of the risk is, I'd say the risk is moderate in that it's not like investing in a startup where there's maybe some chairs and tables and computers to sell if the business goes under, but not much else. But it doesn't have the federal government backing it like as your savings account has. So that's kind of painting the dark, like, the bad things that could happen. So the flip side is that we succeed. The tenants do well. They pay their rent. So we're able to pay those consistent 6% dividends. For those who kind of like that, want to they put another $1,000 in each year, as like some other folks want to pull their funds out. It can kind of be a bit of a compounding dynamic for folks who are interested in long-term investment. And then there's the sort of, so that's the kind of like financial side. And then there's the sort of community benefit side of, having this space have a broad base of folks who have a stake in it, who are in the community. The use of it within kind of as a way of kind of securing this food system use case, the sort of community cafe use case, which the folks who are aiming to be anchor tenants aim to expand the cafe space to be a bit larger, that sort of thing. So the sort of like upside is an investment that throws off cash flow every year and creates that sort of nice opportunity. The downside is just like with any investment that isn't backed by the FDIC or whatever, there's always the chance that things could go sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and when you were describing like if the tenants can't pay their rent, and if the businesses aren't working out, and you do have to like just liquidate, basically you would be losing whatever you invested in it.
That would be the worst. That's like the worst case scenario. Yep.
Right.
Or it could be it liquidates and you get some more, or potentially if there's appreciation on the building, even in that case, like it could be everyone is made whole, but we just sort of decide, okay, we're we feel like we need to sell it. So there's kind of a range of from the like extreme catastrophic scenario of the sky is falling and the economy is in terrible doldrums to okay, this just isn't working out, and we decide that at a certain point we all take our ball and go home kind of collectively, and there's a process in the co-op's bylaws that would allow for that kind of dissolution in an orderly way.
Okay. All right. And then in terms of like you were saying, if you invest and then a year goes by or whatever, and you decide, oh, I think I want to like put my money elsewhere, is there any penalty to like what does that process look like if you want to
right.
retract? I guess. Yeah.
Yep. Good question. So I talked a little bit about that, but yeah, it's essentially the liquidity question.
Yeah.
And so the co-op, basically what it looks like is probably like, again, once a year, the co-op will say, okay, so who out there is interested in having their shares bought back? And sort of shares can be bought back kind of on the it's set up so it's basically like the oldest, if multiple folks are asking, it's the oldest shares are bought back first, right? So it's kind of in the order that they were bought to begin with. And so then you have, so let's say there's like 10 shares that folks want to sell back to the co-op. And let's say that year the co-op says, all right, we have a good reserve, we're feeling comfortable, we're able to pay our dividends, we have a little bit extra left over. So we're going to set aside $3,000 to buy back shares. So the co-op from its reserves could buy back 3,000 that year. And then the co-op would also put the word out and say, if there are any other members or community members who would be interested in purchasing other shares, there's $7,000 worth that there's folks who'd like to send out. So then those folks would be given the opportunity to essentially through the co-op purchase the shares from the folks who wanted to exit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it would be, so you kind of, the oldest shares are bought back first.
Mm-hmm.
And it also depends on how much is in the reserve.
Right. So it would be basically a board of directors decision.
A board of okay.
And so the board once a year would say, okay, let's look at the financial situation and say, all right, so do we feel comfortable offering to use co-op funds to buy any of these shares back this year? Maybe it's no, maybe it's yes, but it would always sort of if there were any members who wanted their shares bought back, would always sort of put the word out and say, okay, so if there's other folks who want to be invested more in the co-op, you can do that. So there's no kind of guarantee in a particular year that someone would have their shares bought back, but there sort of would be a process of request, co-op considers how much it might put towards it, and then the co-op puts the word out more broadly to see if others want to put in that can then offboard folks.
Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. I think that that answers my question. Yeah.
Cool. And I saw Emily Tompkins just joined us.
Yes.
Emily, do you have any do you want to introduce yourself, or do you have any questions you're coming with?
Hi, I'm Emily Tompkins. You have this funny photo of me right now. Sorry I'm late. Today's just like a back-to-back kind of day of all these things. And I guess that question just related to basically exiting the co-op.
Correct. Yep.
And you said it would go to the co-op, does anybody want to buy? And then it would be a broader thing to see if anybody wants to join. And then at whichever point either of those things happen, then the person would basically be bought out.
Exactly.
For their initial investment?
Correct. So the return, so the shares kind of stay at the same level of the $1,000 in. Although one thing we might consider doing kind of down the road we've talked about would be sort of splitting the shares. So right now it really makes sense to do it as 1,000, but once we're kind of going, then there's some folks who said that they'd be interested in having a way of essentially just automatically buying more shares, so like reinvesting their dividend. And so if we were to do split the shares into smaller chunks, then it could be, all right, we get 50 or 100 or $200, in dividends, and then just use those to buy more shares, and that can buy out some of the other folks. I certainly would probably set mine up to do that, and I know some of the other board members are interested in doing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question that, it's probably already been talked over, but which was about the returns. Like, I read about it a little bit. It looked like there was I saw 6%. I wasn't sure what that was. I admittedly did not read things very, very thoroughly. And what I did read, I didn't spend much time with it to fully understand it, or I just wasn't understanding it. But
so it's basically a dividend. Yep, it's a dividend on the sort of face value of the share, right? So if you buy one share, it's $1,000, and the co-op says, all right, we have the board at the end of the year says we have sufficient surplus to pay out a dividend, then our goal would be to pay out $60 per $1,000 share, 6% dividend.
And so that's kind of the profit of the businesses that have been run there over the year.
Well, so that's kind of the profit from the rent. So the co-op owns the building, rents the tenants, and then pays the dividend primarily out of rental income.
Okay, so that's stable.
From our cash reserve, yeah, we'll have a little bit of interest income from our cash reserve and that sort of thing. But the vast majority will be rental income.
Gotcha. So that's that's a pretty stable situation, I guess. And that's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's the deal with the businesses being run there? Is that just with their
so there's
finances?
So there's two kind of anchor tenants who we're in the process of finalizing the lease terms with.
Right. Okay.
So between the two of them, they'll be committed to paying $4,000 a month. One will do kind of breakfast, lunch in the cafe space, and then Cafe Mama Juana will do sort of more of the dinner stuff. And then they will have, so they'll have the run of the full space, which includes the commissary in the back. And that will be something where they're also looking into potentially subletting some of that as storage space or production space to a third business. But the primary lease, at least to begin with, is aiming towards being with those two, and then they'd be subletting and be kind of whatever agreement they make with others would be kind of between them, as long as they're paying their $4,000 a month to the co-op. And the terms we're looking at for the lease would be kind of a three-year lease within 2 5-year options to renew. So with the idea that if there's a third tenant that kind of comes in and it really makes sense and they're working well together, then that third tenant could come on the lease potentially, or they could form some sort of shared services co-op that they're all members of, that has the relationship to the Oak Street Co-op as a sort of tenant landlord relationship. So you can have a single entity that maybe they might all be members of. But that first 3 years is kind of, that initial period, and then, see if another one might want to come in. But it's kind of a down the road thing. So for the moment, we're really looking at it as those two businesses as the anchors.
So yeah, again, maybe I missed this already, but so the return for the investment comes from that 6% dividend?
Correct.
And that basically is a yearly thing, right?
Yep. So every year the board will kind of meet at the end of the year, close the books, and then kind of annually declare the dividend.
Okay. And does that ever change? Or it's basically like you're looking at a 6% like return on your investment annually? Right.
So our sort of target is 6%. We can't legally go higher than that under Vermont's kind of co-op law. So we sort of set it as the maximum. And then, there's the opportunity to, or if the co-op's kind of in a tight financial position, it can defer the dividend, which would mean basically it doesn't pay it out in cash that year, but it's sort of on the books as an obligation to those members. So in the subsequent year, it would, the first thing that the co-op would pay if it's paying a dividend would be pay out the deferred dividends, then pay out the current year dividends, and it couldn't pay out what's called a patronage refund to the sort of tenants if they're members until all the dividends are paid up.
Okay. And where'd you all draw up all these plans from?
It's kind of a mix of inspiration. So there's probably one of the most direct ones is in Minneapolis. There's the Northeast Investment Co-op, which is very similarly structured. They've got actually a pretty good website with some kind of model bylaws and information about how they work. But it's something where they've bought, I think, 2 commercial buildings, rent them to a number of different tenants. So that was kind of, that model was really the inspiration, and I've been kind of batting it around with some folks for a few years, and this opportunity and idea popped up. And after a bunch of assessment and discussion, and kind of a core group came together around it and decided to make a go of it. So now we've got the campaign rolling, and the deadline of kind of March 1st to sort of as the time to raise the equity sufficient for the down payment and startup capital and that sort of thing.
Cool. I have a question about the businesses. I know Maria, and so I know her, the Cafe Mama Juana, I'm familiar with. But the other business, can you tell me a little bit more about what the coffee shop?
Yep. And there's a little bit of there's a little blurb about them in the offering doc if you want to take a gander. But so there's 2 sisters. One has some decent amount of food service experience. The other one's kind of more on the business marketing side. And so basically the model will be light breakfast, lunch fare, pop in kind of coffee, have a little sort of hybrid sort of a little kind of grab and go case, I think is the plan, that has both their food and Maria's food. So it can kind of be something that folks in the neighborhood can either eat in or get things to go that are good and
cool,
locally sourced and all of that. So that's kind of so just like a little cooler kind of in the corner that'll have that sort of stuff.
Cool. I guess I'm not sure if this. I'm unsure about this question, but because these are both new businesses that are starting up, and certainly want everyone to succeed, but like if for some reason business isn't going well and they're not making, they can't make their rent, how does that affect like investors? If it affects investors, I don't know.
Right. So basically, we've got there's a few pieces of security. Like one is, we definitely, have built into the amounts that we're raising, sort of a reserve so that we have some level of the ability to kind of carry mortgage payments and things like that. So it's not like 1 month rent, 1 month or 2 months of like not getting rent totally sink the project, right? We want to have some buffer there. The second piece is in terms of the lease that we're circling in on. We'll have the business owners personally guaranteeing the lease. So if the business kind of goes under, they'll be sort of individually responsible for lease payments, with the understanding that the co-op will make diligent effort to try to find a replacement tenant as soon as possible. So there's that bit of security of it not just being like, okay, the business has declared bankruptcy and we're totally out of it, but we also have the sort of individual guarantees as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I think one of the other pieces that we're definitely keeping an eye on and encouraging them on is the sort of the subletting partnerships with some of the other local food producers, because there's some this whole back kind of portion of the building is this fairly new warehouse with these walk-ins, and there's I think a lot of potential for supporting a few different folks, and there's a bit of diversified revenue streams there as well. I think that's also something that bodes relatively well for the prospects of it, because that would take further pressure off the anchor tenants in terms of their costs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Cool.
Great. So any other questions, Emily?
Yeah. So. Yeah. So with the 6% dividend,
Mm-hmm.
that's to say it would be like basically like 18 years or something for your initial investment to be paid back.
Well, so
am I missing something?
Right. So the share is kind of valued at $1,000, and so it might be
Yeah.
it would be like to double your money might be 18 years if the math is right there. Right, but it's more that you would eventually, if someone's wanting to have their share bought back, they put they put in a request to the co-op. The co-op sort of says, okay, there are other folks either in the co-op or in the broader community who want to invest.
I see.
And then the shares bought back at face value. So you put 1,000 in. 5 years later, if you want to bought back, and the co-op and the larger community have demand and capacity to do that, then you get the 1,000 back, and you don't get dividends anymore, and then kind of your investment is retired essentially.
Right. So you just get bought out and you
Mm-hmm.
have whatever you made over the years from it.
Yep. Exactly.
Uh-huh. And I guess what is the long-term goal? Like just kind of keep it rolling as long as possible. And I guess I could research a little bit the one you mentioned in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so there's kind of some bigger picture conversations around this model, right? This is kind of one of the first pilot projects, kind of testing it out in our community. But there's a as part of the group that was doing the research, there's kind of another space that's also being purchased using the same mechanism, and so it's two separate entities. So right now it's kind of like in this experimental mode, but there's definitely conversations of what does it look like to once there's multiple properties kind of owned this way, what are ways of sharing expenses or federating or even merging some to get economies of scale of insurance and property management and all of these sorts of things, and sort of potential vision for even as this project is gone, there's someone at the info session last week who was talking about how he had just heard that the place that he gets childcare had gotten notice from their landlord that their building was going up for sale, and he was like, oh, this model could be a way that could mobilize other parents to purchase the building the childcare is in and rent it to the childcare to make sure that we don't lose this kind of resource that's hard to get, right? And so I think my hope is that as we kind of like have a couple of these sort of initial projects find their feet, figure out really kind of start working out like any of the kinks in the Vermont context, that there will be kind of opportunities to expand it into other other things that hold space for social enterprises and other co-ops, and or even like the conversion of, say, multi-unit apartment buildings that allow kind of tenants to have some ownership in the place that they live. So I think, like, if I'm going to step back and kind of do the like, in 10 years, what's possible? I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and that this is kind of, as the first attempt to do a sort of public-facing campaign to recruit folks to this model is going to be kind of, both the thing that we can really learn from and can provide a model for other projects going forward. So that excites me.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
So any other thoughts or questions or ideas as you're hearing this and getting your head wrapped around it?
I think I'm all set. This has been really helpful to just talk this stuff out loud, versus like reading it and sort of trying to figure it out by myself. But yeah, I think I have a pretty clear understanding of what the risks are. It sounds, I really like the concept. And yeah.
Hey, Marcy, would you care to, in your own words, say what you understand the risks to be? Because that was like another question I had that, So it sounds like you've got some understanding. So yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, Matt talked about kind of like worst case scenario, sort of like, real estate crash of 2008 or natural disaster or whatever, like something's happening where just like they have to liquidate everything and sell the property. And, in that scenario, you could potentially just like lose your investment. You lose your money. And then sort of like the more moderate scenario where if the co-op doesn't have the money to sustain the building, and that's why I had asked that question about the businesses too before, because I was curious like how much of the business is tied to that. But yeah, we're basically, if the co-op is not able to pay to keep the building, that they would do kind of their best to reimburse people as much as possible. So you're not necessarily completely losing your investment. But, there is a risk of maybe not if you put in $1,000, you might not get your whole $1,000 back. And as far as the tenants, because there's an apartment, this is a question for you, Matt. There's an apartment that's going to be rented out to tenants too, right?
Yes.
Like residential. So if those people aren't able to pay their rent, would that be another factor?
Right. Yeah. So you basically have two flows of funds, right? You have the flow of funds from the commercial space, and you have the flow of funds from the 3-bedroom apartment. And so so kind of a one kind of point of risk is that one or both of those could be something where there's issues happen and they stop paying. And again, this becomes kind of like where making sure that we as the board, aim to maintain a sufficient reserve fund to be able to kind of cover times when there's vacancies, right? So we have kind of like a vacancy reserve and a reserve for, we set aside a certain amount of money every year for capital expenses on the building, and a certain amount of money for maintenance and all that. So we want to kind of make sure we have those pots of money in place and kept topped up, so that kind of like we're able to, take a time where, okay, have a few months of, a tenant stops paying, and again, sort of one of those sort of risks would be like we have to evict them, and then we don't get or we have to sort of turn the apartment, and so we miss a few months rent. So really making sure that we have the sort of reserve fund to kind of manage that risk is an important piece of the strategy. But that's kind of like really where the key risks are in my view.
What would cause a depletion of those reserves then?
I mean, it would be, essentially saying, okay, so if we don't have a tenant, we're still having to make a mortgage payment, we're still having to pay property taxes, those sorts of
That makes sense.
expenses that don't stop when we're not receiving income.
Well, and what about like maintenance of the building or something? Suddenly there's like a $10,000 project that needs to happen.
Exactly. So setting aside the reserves and also kind of creating a schedule to look at. Okay, so the building, in this case, the building had a new roof put on like not terribly long ago, and those tend to last in the neighborhood of like 30 to 50 years. So that's something we won't have to pay for a while, but we should still put aside a little bit every year that's going towards that. So when that comes up, it's we're not kind of, it's not unexpected. Or things like, all right, water heaters, replace that every 15 years, other sort of major things. So really kind of like part of the ongoing planning is to have that kind of list of, these are the expected capital expenses, and then so we can kind of plan to make sure that we have the reserves to meet those expectations, plus a little bit of wiggle room for if something fails early or what have you, so we're not caught in a situation where that totally slams our ability to do the kind of core things we need to do. But yeah, I think you articulated the risks pretty well there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was gonna say, like, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a long day and it's like, okay. Well, this is good though, because it's getting me thinking also just about like the building itself, and it's it's like almost like is there with a lot of the older housing in Burlington, things come up. I've had friends buy houses, and all of a sudden it's like I have to spend 20 grand on blah de blah, and I had no idea. So I'm wondering maybe just like around the structure and
yeah. So we did have week before last, we had a building inspection. So
Okay.
I walked through with a professional inspector for a good 3.5 hours, kind of him pointing out all the various things I should be paying attention to, and he created a report that we shared out to the pledge member list actually in our last update email recently. So fortunately, it was like nothing major kind of like derailing was found. There's some minor things like okay, there's the furnace vent is far too low to the ground. It should have a piece of PVC pipe so that it doesn't get covered by snow, and some things that were like a few items that were like definitely deal with soon. A few things that were more list of things that were like keep an eye on that. The foundation seems pretty solid. So they have put a good amount of work into it. So it's one of those things where I think my impression of it was that there was a decent it's an old building, but it's a building that's been relatively well maintained, and there's definitely improvements we can do, both from a basic operations perspective, and then certainly from there's some stuff like once we have some reserves, we want to like increase the environmental sustainability of the building, put some new windows in the apartment, things like that as we have the the capital maintenance reserves to do it, would make sense to just kind of have that checklist to walk through. And then if we're, really feeling good and having a nice reserve, like solarize the building, that sort of stuff. So you can eventually have your imagination go wild about, what it can possibly be. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, get through that first checklist before doing
Right.
the ambitious stuff.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Matt, I think you've done a great. I have to jump off. My dog is dying to go out, and I have to have her on a leash since she just had surgery.
Oh no!
I think you've done a great job in answering all the questions. And just so that you guys know, I'm Louisa, and I'm the one who runs Milk Money Investing, which is where the co-op and all the information are on. So if you have any technical issues, let me know. Another pledge did come in while we were on, so you're up to 59,000.
Woo!
Yeah.
Thanks. Good to see you, Louisa.
Yeah, thank you. And just this will be available because you're recording it, so we can.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I'll throw something. Keep this as a resource for other folks who are interested.
Great. And Marcy and Emily, you guys asked amazing questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Cool.
Where the reserves that you're talking about? Yeah, are those going to be basically built up from the rent then?
Right. So we're going to start with, in terms of our kind of business plan pro forma, and the amount we're seeking to raise, right? We're planning on starting with a certain level of reserve. And actually, I can sort of pull up what our kind of intended initial sort of reserve would be. Yeah. So depending on, it depends on a few things, but aiming to have, at the end of year one, about 20,000 in sort of cash as a reserve for dealing with contingencies. And then and I think sort of generally the target will be, and the board will revisit this each year as it sort of like refines its understanding of what work needs to be done and all of that, right? So it sets a budget. But sort of I think setting the target of having kind of 6 months of operating expenses for the building kind of in the kind of in reserve, so that we can deal with, like, all right, if both of our tenants suddenly disappeared at once, we could deal with 6 months of that before starting to look at a cash crunch. That to me feels like a solid amount. That then, okay, so if we're above that, then funds for share buybacks can start going out and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Cool.
I think,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just trying to think of another question.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I had one, but I can't remember right now. So.
Yeah.
Well, if anything pops up after this, definitely feel free to shoot an email. The address the address that's in the informational document kind of forwards to me, so I'm happy to answer any questions if it occurs to you later tonight and you want to send it along.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm kind of feeling like I have most of my basic questions taken care of, and I think I need to have some dinner. I'm honestly feeling a little like low blood sugar. It's 8 o'clock. But this has been great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on and bringing good questions. So I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.